Hi, welcome, Donatella, to the launch event of the Catalan Political Science Association. And I'm going to start just saying a few words for the audience in Catalan in order to introduce you to the audience, even though I'm pretty sure you don't need an introduction, as in everyone will know who you are. But benvinguts, benvingudes. Tenim a la Donatella de la Porta, una de les politòlogues més importants a nivell global. La Donatella de la Porta és catedràtica en ciència política, és degana de la Facultat de Ciències Polítiques i Socials i directora del programa de doctorat de l'Escola Normal i Superiore Influència del Departament de Ciència Política i Sociologia. I a més és la líder del reconegut Centre en Estudis de Moviments Socials Cosmos. Té una trajectòria increïble, ha estat l'autora o editora de més de 90 llibres, 150 articles acadèmics i 150 contribucions en volums editats. Ha publicat sobretot en recerca sobre moviments socials, violència política, terrorisme, corrupció, la policia i les activitats policials en relació a la protesta. És increïble la quantitat de treball i de recerca que ens ha proveït amb moltes generacions de politòlegs. A més, és doctora honorària de les universitats de Lausanne, Bucarest, Göteborg, Jyväskylä i de la Universitat del Peloponès. Doncs començarem amb aquesta conferència inaugural i entrevista, que ha sigut el format que hem decidit tirar endavant. I bé, benvinguda, Donatella. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mónica. Estic molt contenta de participar en la inauguració de l'Associació de Ciència Política de Catalunya.
Nosaltres també estem molt contentes. Moltes gràcies, Donatella. So I'll start with the first question. And so, of course, as I already said, thank you so much for kindly agreeing to deliver the keynote interview for the launch of the Catalan Political Science Association. We are certainly privileged that you have agreed to do so. And I would like to start by asking you about your outstanding trajectory and your relationship to the discipline of political science. And so in terms of that, what would you say are the key issues for political scientists today?
Well, I think that in political science, as in other disciplines, there is always a tendency to bring back in concepts that were important in the past, were a bit forgotten, and need to be revisited and updated. In my own career, what I tried to do was to look at political science from a perspective which is a bit different from the mainstream ones. Let's say to embed politics within the broader societies, the broader economic transformations. And so I looked at politics as another politic, and I think that this is particularly relevant today. I've looked at politics in what I consider to be as the better developments of it, for instance, looking at participations from below, civil society, intervention, and the capacity of the people, the citizens to participate in politics. But I've also been looking at the negative sides of politics, sometimes hidden, like political corruption. Well, in a moment in which participation is increasing everywhere with new conflicts and different transformations, I think that we need to broaden the attentions of all political science to this important element of democracy. And I think that this is particularly important in a moment in which representative democracies under stress. But this is not necessarily a negative thing in the sense that it stimulates positive transformations. As and Catalonia is, I think, an example of this, with the dynamic and attention to participations of the citizens, both at the city level and at the national level. On the other hand, what we see in this period is that corruption is far from forgotten. Just in these days, the Pandora Papers have shown the tight interactions between economic and political elite, but not only this, also the criminal sides of these interactions. And so I think that it is impossible to study politics and democracy without considering also this type of mechanisms that are not officially recognized, but are relevant. And another thing that I consider as even more important in these times is to connect the research on the micro level, on individual forms of participations, for instance, or belief, public opinions, and so on, with research at the meso level, is the organizational level, but also at the macro level. So here I think that what is particularly important in this moment is to bring back in issues of capitalism, class, and elements that have been strangely forgotten also in social movement studies for a long time, but it have re-emerged with strength in recent moments because successions of crises brought about the need to reflect also on how these crises originate in structural transformations. And I think that the important point is to look at the varieties of capitalism, at its dynamic and continuous crisis, but also at the ways in which agencies can help intervening on this. And once again, I think that Catalonia has been a model and a sort of experiments in democratic innovations that have addressed also the fundamental questions of how much inequalities can democracy support, and how we need to transform democracy in order to take into account the fact that the citizens are always more critical, dissatisfied, and ready to fight for their own rights. Two other elements that I want to add very shortly is one, that I think political science needs to look at the relational path, so that we don't need to sort of specialize in sort of closed boxes, parties, social movements, institutions, markets and states, and so on, but look at the complex interactions within different type of fields, arenas in which players are multiple and influence each other. And the last thing is, I think we have to recognize the cultural dimensions of politics, which means the ways in which different actors intervene is related with their perceptions of opportunities, of constraints, of their own strength. And this is important because the empowerment of different groups of the populations is also related with this meaning work that is fundamental in politics.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. And so much food for thought as well there for all of us as political scientists. I think that connects very well with the next question that I wanted to ask you, because I think it's important to think back to your own contributions to the study of social movements, which have not just been really numerous, but they have really shaped the field and that many of us have kind of entered. And also, as you were mentioning, particularly in the last decade, you have very forcefully argued for the necessity precisely to consider capitalism and issues to do with the political economy as key elements in understanding social movements, to go beyond that individual and collective grievances, which were very much what had characterized social movement research, perhaps the previous 20 or 30 years of very individualized vision of what social movement participation is. And so I've got a couple of questions connected to that. The first one, and why do we need to locate those protests and social movements? And I quote you here, actually, in those linkages between capitalism and democracy. And the second question connects with what we've witnessed in the last decade. Catalonia, as you've mentioned, has been really at the forefront in a sense of some of those protests, but many other places in Europe, like Greece and Italy as well, to an extent, France, we've seen that in many places, the United States. But to what extent are the anti-austerity protests of the last decade a consequence of the failings of capitalism and representative democracy in being able to provide opportunities for people, the issues of inequality, for example, that you were highlighting before? And how can we consider these movements different to previous waves of social movements? So a lot of questions.
Well, it's a very central point, and in studying the relationship between especially two waves of protest, and now even a third one, we have started to investigate the interactions between capitalism and democracy, as when we talk about structural transformations, thinking about neoliberalism and late neoliberalism, as I called it in one of my books, we are always looking at the interactions between state and market, between the economy and politics and society. And I think this is a very central point for these three waves of protest. The first related with the global justice movement, the second one with the anti-austerity protest, and then the various movements that developed around in the second half, let's say, of the years 2010, and that were particularly strong in Catalonia with the interactions of many different types of conflicts and tensions. So 2019, the last pre-pandemic years, was a year that was characterized by many and very intense struggles in Catalonia, but also in Lebanon, in Hong Kong, in France, in different countries. Which type of movements are these, and which type of innovations is related with these transformations? In social movement studies, we have two main approaches, two movements that emerged in time of crisis. One is the Polanyi's type of counter movements that tend to look at movement of crisis, at movements as a moment of backward-looking defense of existing characteristics of existing rights and so on. And usually this approach tends to look at movements as a sort of resisting change, resisting the domination of the market of the society. It's a typical Polanyi type of transformations. On the other hand, there is another vision that has been proposed by scholars like Immanuel Wallerstein and the World System Economy, that have stressed instead the fact that crises tend to produce strong anti-systemic movements that aim at deep transformations in politics, in the economy, and in societies. And these are more forward-looking. So, what did we observe in research, looking especially at the anti-austerity protest, but also the long wave that followed the anti-austerity protest, is that, of course, both aspects are important. That protests are made of coalitions of different groups, that at the same time aim to recover memories of the past and to build up also new visions. These anti-systemic and counter movements tend to have a different type of balances in different countries, in different moments. But what we saw is that these protests have brought in very strongly the class dimensions and the importance also of the social backgrounds of protesters. These have been movements of precarious people, but in which precarity was not just the precarity of the youth that couldn't find permanent positions or even decent work, but it was also precariousness of workers that were losing their rights on the labor market and on the labor places, and of retired people with that have particularly also hit women, migrants, and so on. And so there have been movements that have connected these different rights. And they have been movements that have been deeply transformative. Transformative inside themselves. So for instance, the reflections on participatory and deliberative forms of democracy has been particularly relevant. But they have been also important in transforming the outside, in transforming politics and societies. This especially where these movements have been stronger, and in Europe, the Greek case, the Icelandic case, the Irish case, the Spanish case, the Portuguese case have been important, but also in different territories. So the Catalan case is in this analysis particularly relevant because it testifies of the interactions between different cleavages from the territorial to the social one, but also the transformations that moment of protest have on both. So if we think about the situation in Catalonia, what we see is that these social movements of different types have been able to have an impact on politics through the development of movement parties, for instance, which Barcelona en Comú is one of the most quoted and most studied example, but also referendums from below, and we have studied the Catalan referendums on independence as an example of this, and even more deeply, what's in some work I call the crowdsourced referendum, so constitutions, so constitutions in which the participations of the people is particularly relevant, and that I think will be very important also in the future. We see the example in Chile, but we know that many other attempts are ongoing exactly because the dimensions of the crisis was such that it required also deep transformations in order to re-establish a social pact and the political pact that were broken.
Excellent, thank you so much. And actually, I'm going to be asking a little bit in a kind of a follow-up, because you you already mentioned the high levels of social mobilization that Catalonia has experienced, amongst other places. But I think, as you've already mentioned, Catalonia does stand out a little bit, precisely because of the variety as well of issues and movements that have occurred. And so, we've had from anti-austerity protests and movements. Particularly, it's worth highlighting the very strong housing movements that we've had over the last decade as well, which connects with the idea of precariousness that you were talking about, because obviously, being evicted, losing your home, it's a high level of precariousness at that point. So I know you're well aware of the PA, also more recently the Sindicat de Llogateres, the tenants union, to the large mass-scale organization of the 2017 referendum. We've just had the 4th anniversary over the last few days of that. So what would be your advice in a context of such high mobilization environment that we've had in Catalonia? What would be your advice to political scientists that actually work and live in such a high level of mobilization environment?
Well, I think you are touching to issues that are relevant, very visible in Catalonia, but are most important also in other European and non-European countries. And I think also testify of the importance to look at capitalism transformations together with transformations in democracy. You mentioned the housing conditions that was very relevant in the development of the anti-austerity protest in Catalonia in particular, that also role that Ada Colau had in this type of movements, but more generally, and in only a few days ago in Berlin, there was a referendum called for by movements that asked for any interventions on the housing market that has been, say, under very strong deregulation processes. And these times are also times in which many issues emerge as a non-negotiable, as a symbol of the deep transformations and the sort of stripping off social rights that capitalism developed had. So deregulation is felt by the citizens on housing, but privatizations is felt in the university system. In Italy, we had a few years ago a very important referendum against the privatizations of water supply that also became a symbol of how privatizations is taking away power from political institutions that are very difficult to win back, but that are very important to win back. And well, what I would suggest to do in this moment is to challenge a bit the idea on which a lot of political science have been developing in the past, not because I want to be revolutionary, but because I think that a lot of this methodological tool were also developed especially for normal times. So times that could be predicted, and they could be predicted because structures were strong. So structures tended to control the developments of society. It's the longue durée, historians call longue durée. These are instead times that are extremely intense. I use the terms of time intensifications also as an effect at times of protest that becomes critical junctures. And in this time, rational choice is very difficult to practice because you cannot predict how the situation is changes. The type of institutional approach are still relevant, but they have to take into account that these are not times of gradual transformations and path dependency, but rather they are times of quick ruptures, so more of critical junctures than of path dependency. So there are times that scholars have described as times typical of, for instance, democratization processes. They are highly contingent, because structures are weakened. They are open-ended because so many actors interact and the stake is very relevant for all of them. And there are times in which agencies counts a lot. And in this moment, I think the agencies is not so much, or it is also not so much the agencies, or not only the agencies of the elite, but also even more the agencies of the cities. So important changes that are related with these quick changes, critical junctures, crises, and so on. I think it requires transformations in the ways in which we look at events, because these tend to be transformative. The terms that historians and sociologists like Bill Sewell used in his analysis of temporality. So they are a time of what McAdam, Tilly, and Taro called contentious politics. They are contentious times, and I think that this is something to focus upon. Also, what I would say is that there are times in which different cleavages are defrozen. So if political science in the past, on the lead of important contributions by Lipset or Roccan, were thinking about the freezing of and stabilizations, pacifications of existing cleavages. What we have seen in the last decade has been a reopening of class cleavages, a reopening that has been particularly virulent and particularly visible, particularly strong in Catalonia, of the territorial cleavage, center-periphery conflicts. It has been also a moment of re-emerging of cleavages between the church and the state on many type of issues, including gender rights, women's rights, and so on. And conflicts like the ones in France on the Gilets jaunes have put the focus, put attentions to a new conflicts between the city and countryside, between big metropolis and their periphery, and so on. So I think that it is important to consider all these interactions and how this creates at the same time threats and opportunities for different actors.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that's certainly a fantastic answer in terms of how we should be focusing and how the discipline also needs to change in relation to what's happening out there. And of course, something else has happened in the last few years. You've already mentioned it, but something that has been certainly very disruptive, and that has been the pandemic, which has also been disruptive to social movement organizing, besides disruptive to life in general, obviously. But we could also think about how social movements have reacted very quickly by setting up mutual aid groups in neighborhoods, villages, and cities. And we've also, alongside this kind of social distancing, as they've called it, and lockdowns and that kind of thing, we've also seen a large wave of organizing in the past 18 months in some places and over certain issues. So I'm thinking from Black Lives Matter protests, particularly in the United States, but also to an extent in Europe. And we're also witnessing in that return to class that you've mentioned a few times, a return of grassroots strikes, labor organizing, particularly amongst more precarious workers. So what do you think will be the key points of contention over the next few years?
Also very relevant questions. I think that there will be several. What's a bit surprised us was in fact that while social distances and lockdown even more seem to imply that social movements needed to take a break, to stop at least for some times. The pandemic time has been extremely contentious, and from the very beginning. So we are doing some research at Cosmos, and what we saw is that conflicts re-emerged on labor issues since the very beginning in different forms. They have restructured the visions of some jobs and positions, showing what is essential, and showing also that essential jobs were underpaid and were performed especially by the most precarious people. And this has created also space for protest and organizations on the labor side. We have seen conflicts on environmental issues, so the connections between the pandemic and the environmental disruptions has been immediate, also visible in the development of the COVID-19 itself, that was hitting especially areas that were particularly under stress from the environmental point of view. So the connections between these two crises was very evident. But also they have pointed at the weaknesses of neoliberal states. So at the weaknesses of states that had given up several of their competences, leaving them to the market and to a merchandising logic. So starting from the health system and public health, what became immediately evident is the killing effect, use a term that Goran Tebon has used, the killing effects of inequalities that were related with the fact that the poor people had already worse health conditions, but also that the capacity to avoid the virus or the worst effect of the viruses were very much related with the capacity of paying for services. This was particularly evident in countries that had a weak welfare state, like the United States, in which very often the pandemic meant losing a job, and we did also losing access to health insurances and so on. But was also evident in the unequal distributions of the health impact of the pandemics in different countries. And at the same time, it showed that all citizens' rights are connected. So not only the poorest people were hit unequally and more by the pandemics, but it was also much more difficult to keep social distances during the pandemic. It was difficult to find a nice environment for the lockdown periods. It was difficult to study, especially in the countries in which the commercializations of education was more advanced. So it has connected this right with the potential for also bridging different movements. For instance, the women's movement had immediately pointed at the major risks of violence for women, but also all the problematic of care and caring that during the pandemic became all the more visible. Same for young people who paid very high cost, not in terms of life, but in terms of quality of life, for sure. So potentially this means social movements that resisted the pandemic, resisted also neoconservative backlash, can find space for alliances, for building coalitions. That it's a process that we have seen ongoing in very different cities and so on. And you mentioned self-help and mutual aid. And I think these observations helps us also as social movement scholars to realize that we have to expand our visions beyond the protest in the streets and consider also what movements do in terms of practicing the objective they have, in terms of being able to help their own constituencies, but also to help the people in need, to express solidarity. And this is not something that refers only to pandemic times. It was also there in the anti-austerity protest. And in fact, it has been important for progressive movements to build upon these experiences in how to organize solidarity so that it goes beyond charity and that is able to politicize the claims by social movements. There is also another area of interventions of social movements that I think is particularly important during pandemic time, and it is the building of alternative knowledge. So it is a moment in which there are many tensions, many also within social movements between freedom and solidarity, concerns for the other, how to articulate freedom, how to innovate in protest, how to blend democracy using new tools, new technological tools, but also cherishing physical encounters that are still very important. So these are, I think, opportunities for movements, but of course in the pandemic times, there are also threats and problems to address. So I've been looking at other movements that mobilized during catastrophes and big crises. And what we know is that, for instance, pandemics have been important also in the past. Just think about AIDS pandemic. In order for social movement activists and citizens to reflect upon different ways to look at epidemiology, virology, and so on, to construct the sickness. This has been, however, also important to consider that virus, also other catastrophes like wars, but especially airborne virus like COVID-19 are particularly challenging in terms of potential disintegrations, potential scapegoating, potential effect of fears, and so on. And that the pandemic has been not at all, it was claimed in the beginning, a sort of leveling effect. Not everybody, as I mentioned, was equal in the pandemic time. To the contrary, there's been a development of a lot of potential fragmentations also in terms of relationship with politics, resources available, and so on. So these three are important, are there for movements to address. I think that if we think to the pandemic, unique events, drama, and so on, but looking for something similar in the past that can help us, if not to predict the future, at least help us to single out where to look. I think that research on wars and research on big natural catastrophe tell us about the potential for solidarity, the potential for transformation. So the Spanish flu in the past, also related with airborne virus, was considered to be an health reform pandemic, in the sense that it produced a lot of the welfare type of public health institutions that we had. Wars have also been considered by historians like Chastilli as bringing about the potential for strong conflicts, but also acquisitions of rights. In many countries in Europe, like my own, women started to be given the right to vote after the Second World War. And this is related with the fact that sufferance, being asked for sacrifice, brings about also the perceptions of the rights to have something in exchange, but also the empowerment of the citizens, the understanding that it is not the moment in which anyone is a truth that one has to follow, but that you need critical citizenship development, that you need space, once again, for participations, for deliberations, for reconstituting the ties that the pandemic may have challenged. And so I think that it is difficult to predict what will happen, because also if we look at wars or big catastrophe, we know that the effects are complex and they not always went in the directions of progress or more empowerment for the citizens. But for sure, connecting this with what I was saying before, these are once again time that are very intense, and so in which contingency, open-ended process give also more space for agencies. And I think this is important in general for politicians, for activists, but it is important also for political scientists to consider, and to consider also that in this moment in particular, we need to challenge a bit the hyper specializations within the disciplines and consider that contentious politics and institutions are not sealed away one from the other, not separated, and that a dialogue between those who study contentions, those who study policies, those who study elections, those who study parties, is all the more relevant in order to understand complex phenomena.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has really been a lot of food for thought, I think, for us, certainly for me, but also I think for the audience that will be listening to this. I really want to thank you again for your time and for sharing your insights, reflections, and vast amount of knowledge with all of us. And I do hope that once the pandemic is over or under control, that we're actually able to welcome you in person to Barcelona, because that would be really, really amazing.
I thank you very much, and it has been really a pleasure and an honor to participate in this inauguration. We already had our first conference in presence in Florence, and I went to my first conference in presence in Greece. So I hope that the post-pandemic times will start soon, and I congratulate you, first of all, on this achievement to establish a new association of political scientists in an exciting time and in an exciting part of Europe like Catalonia is. So thank you very much and good luck.
Mille grazie, Donatella. Thank you.